believe in that Mount St. Helens story?
I sure do. I knowed old Fred Beck who told me about it.
I'm Ken Gerhard, cryptozoologist, and today we're going to talk about the so-called Ape Canyon incident. And in the annals of Bigfoot, it is one of the classic stories that everyone's heard about. And it's pretty dramatic too, because it involves supposedly an attack by several Sasquatches on a cabin that was inhabited by some miners in Washington State near Mount St. Helens. And according to the stories, they literally were under siege all night as these Bigfoot creatures tried to pummel their cabin with rocks and break in and do them harm. And this was supposedly a revenge attack because these miners had shot one of these Bigfoot creatures. So it's a pretty cool story, and we're going to talk about that today. One of the real challenges with deciphering the Ape Canyon incident is it's a very old story. Supposedly it happened in July of 1924. And it's been retold many times in newspaper articles from the time, by word of mouth handed down from the survivors, the miners that were there. And there was even a book written in 1967 called I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens by one of these surviving miners, a guy named Fred Beck. And there's slightly different details through the years that have emerged, but I think we at least have a basic storyline that we can point to, and it's a pretty remarkable story.
I want to take this time to say thank you for watching That Bigfoot Show. Please like, share, and subscribe. And click that bell to get notifications on future content. Now, back to the show.
So, first of all, we got to talk about the location. Ape Canyon is what it's called these days, but it was only named that supposedly after this incident occurred. But it's about 2 miles east of Mount St. Helens in Washington State and about 8 miles west of a place called Spirit Lake. And Spirit Lake was said to be haunted by Native American spirits called the Sihatik, which sound very much like Bigfoots or Sasquatches. They were like big, powerful, hairy, man-like creatures. And for this reason, supposedly, a lot of the Native Americans didn't want to go into this particular area. But there were 5 miners. Their names were Fred Beck, his father-in-law Marion Smith, his brother-in-law Leroy or Roy Smith, and 2 other gentlemen. One guy was named Gilbert or Gabe Lefevre, and a guy named John Peterson. And these 5 miners basically established a gold mine. They named it the Vander White, and this has been documented in Washington State records. And this particular mine was on a very steep cliff wall where they had basically blasted out with dynamite and built this tunnel, and they were looking for or prospecting for gold. Although if they didn't find gold, they also had access to iron ore and other things that they could mine out of this particular cave. So they were up in this location for several years. So the first really weird thing that happened was in 1922, they found some giant human-like footprints in the mud next to a place called Muddy Creek, which is a tributary of the Lewis River. And they didn't look at them too close, but they looked like big human-like prints, and they were very deep in the mud. And these guys figured, well, maybe there are some like gigantic Native American people out here that are fishing, and you know, that's the only thing they could think of to explain that. And then shortly thereafter, they began to hear weird noises around their cabin. Loud, piercing whistling noises that would emanate from the mountaintops, and sometimes there were multiple whistles that would answer each other. And they also began to hear these loud thumping noises during the day, and they couldn't figure out what these things were. Although I have a theory about that maybe that was related to the volcanic activity on Mount St. Helens. But anyways, weird noises, strange footprints, and then things got really weird. Now, one thing that's worth pointing out is that in this particular area, there had long been stories of strange creatures. I'm not talking about the Native American stories of the Sihatik, but some of the miners and loggers that worked this area would talk about mountain devils. That's what they would often call them. Or gorillas, or sometimes big hairy apes, which to me sounds a little bit weird because aren't all apes hairy? But anyways, I digress. So there were stories of weird creatures in this particular area. But they never actually, these miners that were there working this area, they didn't really give it any thought, although they were pretty freaked out by weird noises they were hearing and strange footprints and so on and so forth. But events culminated on July 1st, 1924, when Fred Beck was traveling down to a spring along with Marion Smith to get some water. And suddenly Fred noticed a creature peeking out at them from behind a tree. And he described it as about 7 feet tall, weighing close to 800 pounds, covered in dark brown fur with a grayish tinge, and having somewhat of an ape-like face with a pug nose. And it was peeking out from behind a tree. And Fred goes, "Look at that." And then suddenly Marion Smith, who had a .357 Remington rifle, fired 3 shots into the thing's head. And, or at least they thought they'd shot this thing in the head. However, it began to run off and disappear. So after they had shot at this thing, they started working their way down to where they had seen it. Fred was kind of moving fast, and Marion tried to slow him down and said, "Hey, man, there's no need in rushing. I shot that fool 3 times in the head. He ain't going anywhere." But apparently the thing did, because when they got down there, they saw it running up a hill and out of sight. So that was the first thing that was really strange.
Kept crashing down, the cabin kept shaking, and they kept shooting, but they never knew if they hit one of them.
So this is one juncture where the story has 2 different interpretations. The first shooting happened on July 1st, and according to some stories, the miners actually packed up and went home for July 4th and then returned to the mine. In another interpretation of the story, everything happened much faster than that. But it's believed that the actual attack happened on July 10th, 1924. And at that time, the guys were already on edge. They'd seen this Bigfoot creature, they'd shot at it, it hadn't died, so they were already pretty jumpy and thinking about getting out, packing up their stuff and getting out of this location, abandoning their mine, essentially. But Fred Beck was walking and he saw supposedly one of these creatures again, very close to a ravine. And at this time they were all carrying rifles because they were so much on edge. And Fred Beck claimed that he pumped 3 shots from his .30-30 Winchester into the back of this Bigfoot creature, which was essentially standing on the edge of a precipice, and its body pummeled over the cliff and fell down into the canyon below. And shortly thereafter, this particular canyon became known as Ape Canyon because of the fact that this Bigfoot had supposedly fallen into it. Well, at this point, the men decided they were going to get out the next morning. So that night, the men were in their cabin. And a lot of people visualized this nice rustic log cabin. It wasn't like that at all. They were actually on the side of a very steep incline on this canyon wall, and they had basically this structure that they'd put together, a lean-to, if you will, but it was well fortified.
By the time they got back to the cabin, they were pretty scared.
Well, suddenly they began to hear thudding sounds on the outside walls, and what they interpreted to be large rocks being thrown on top of their cabin. So they realized at this point that they were under attack by these creatures. As the night progressed, things got worse. More banging, as if these things were actually trying to break down the walls and break into the cabin. And it was this point that the most dramatic thing happened, which was a very large, powerful, hairy arm reached through a crack between 2 logs and grabbed the handle of an axe and began to drag one of their axes outside. And according to Fred Beck, Marion Smith, thinking quickly, turned the handle of the axe to a right angle so this Bigfoot creature could not pull an axe outside. And he actually aimed his rifle down the axe handle and fired at the thing. That's when things got really crazy. These creatures were throwing rocks, banging on the walls. Fred Beck described it as, it sounded like a herd of horses that were basically trampling on the rooftop. And at this point, the men surely thought that their number had been called. In fact, according to one interpretation, Marion Smith was rocking back and forth in a chair and maniacally saying, "If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone and we'll all go home in the morning." So picture the scene. These 5 miners in an isolated camp, in a structure high up on a mountain, rocks pummeling down on them, something unseen banging and smashing at the walls, trying to literally break in. They're firing their guns in all directions, frantically trying to defend themselves. Marion Smith is rocking back and forth in a chair maniacally, asking for these creatures to go away and just leave them alone. I mean, this whole situation conjures images right out of a horror movie. As you can imagine, the following morning, the miners had resolved that they were going to get the heck out of there. So, armed with their rifles, they began to make their way down the mountain. And according to one account, this is when Fred Beck shot the second Bigfoot creature, causing it to fall off the cliff. So we don't really know. But one thing they had decided is that they weren't going to talk about this to anyone because, frankly, no one would believe them. However, when they finally got down to Spirit Lake, Marion Smith knew the ranger on duty, a guy named Bill Welch, and he looked so terrified and freaked out that Welch knew that something was afoot. By the time the miners got back to their hometown of Kelso, Washington, the story spread like wildfire that these guys had been attacked by these mountain devils. And subsequently, this place became known as Ape Canyon. About a couple of days after the incident, on July 12th, 1924, there was actually an article in the Oregonian newspaper that talked about this attack. And shortly thereafter, there was even a quote-unquote monster hunt, which to my understanding was actually some law enforcement officials, sheriff's deputies, and reporters that went with Fred Beck and some of the miners and returned to the location of the cabin attack to see what they could find. And according to at least one account, there were large human-like footprints. In later retellings, Fred Beck said that they were 19 inches long. But other than some footprints and some rocks strewn about, that was all the evidence they found. As a Bigfoot investigator, one of the most important aspects of the Ape Canyon incident to me is the fact that these miners back in 1924 were basically describing the classic Bigfoot or Sasquatch. 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in hair, basically human-like, but also very ape-like. And, these descriptions, this is long before anyone had ever heard of Bigfoot. Now, there were stories of Sasquatch coming out of British Columbia around this time period. But where did these miners get these stories of apes? Big, hairy man-like apes, very powerful, whistling, throwing rocks. I mean, this could literally be a Bigfoot account from modern times, not 1924. So that's quite fascinating. Another thing worth considering is how strange and mysterious this particular location is, even without the story of the Ape Canyon incident and the Bigfoot attack. We had mentioned Spirit Lake. The Native Americans of that area had many stories and legends of spirits, mountain devils, and other strange occurrences. But in 1950, there was actually a skier named Jim Carter, no relation to the president as far as I know. He was with a group of about 20 mountain climbers from Seattle that had actually summited Mount St. Helens. And on the way down, they were going to ski. And Carter decided he was going to diverge off from the rest of the group so he could actually get some photographs of them skiing down. Well, that was at about 8,000 feet, and according to the other mountain climbers that came down, that was the last they ever saw of Carter. He completely vanished without a trace. Now, I say this, they were able to go back and find his ski marks where he had come downhill, and it looked to them as if it was rather a frantic trajectory, as if something was chasing him at the time. And the only clue they found was an empty film canister, and then suddenly his skid marks disappeared at the edge of a sheer cliff. As you can imagine, there was a massive manhunt that was mounted, and many people went and looked for the remains of Jim Carter. But to this day, they've never found him. And so this particular disappearance has gotten woven into the fabric of Ape Canyon. A really cool aspect of the Ape Canyon story is that in 2013, an enterprising Bigfoot investigator named Mark Marcel actually found the spot where the cabin had been located. And this was on a very steep wall, canyon wall above Ape Canyon. He'd figured out the location based on different newspaper articles and other clues that he found in old documented materials. But here's the clincher. When he shimmied down the steep wall to where he thought this cabin was located, he actually found the remains of tools, rusted out nails, and other clues that this was in fact the location where the cabin, the infamous cabin, had been located. And throughout the years, there have been a handful of Bigfoot investigators that have been able to return to this location. So as the investigations continue, surely Mark Marcel and others will uncover more clues about the Ape Canyon incident. And maybe someday we'll have definitive proof that something mysterious did happen at that location. There's also sort of a spiritual, or almost what we refer to as a woo-type element to the Ape Canyon story as well. Because in later years, the lone survivor, Fred Beck, who became an evangelical minister at that point, wrote a book called I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens. And in that book, he actually portrays the incidents quite differently, claiming that these were not actual Bigfoot creatures, flesh and blood, but that they were spirits or demons or some other type of supernatural entities. And that's why seemingly they couldn't be properly shot and killed. And he also claims that he had telepathic communications with the creatures, and there were other spirits that were appearing to him, a mysterious woman in white and Native American spirits and so forth. So we certainly have that particular angle of the story as well. Who knows? Another strange aspect to the Ape Canyon story is the fact that there were many mysterious deaths of these miners, the men that had survived the incident. Other than Fred Beck, all of the other surviving miners died prematurely of unusual circumstances. 2 of the gentlemen drowned in boating accidents in the same river. Another gentleman died of mysterious circumstances. So it's almost like a King Tut curse type of element where you know, these men that had lived through this harrowing night, this assault, this siege by these Bigfoot creatures, ultimately met really grisly and untimely deaths.
I've heard that same story from a whole lot of people up my way. It's always the same. I'm inclined to believe that's the gospel truth.
In retrospect, the Ape Canyon incident is one of the classic stories in Bigfoot lore. I mean, first of all, because it involves an alleged attack by Bigfoot creatures, something that's actually very rare, fortunately, in the annals of Bigfoot lore. There aren't a lot of accounts of Bigfoot or Sasquatch creatures physically assaulting people. But you have to think that this was kind of an act of revenge, because these miners had intruded on these Bigfoot creatures' habitat and shot at them, potentially shot one of them, driving its body off a cliff. So this was probably an act of retaliation. But what's interesting to me is that it incorporates rock throwing and whistling and large, hairy, man-like creatures standing about 7 feet tall and weighing 800 pounds, footprints 13 to 15 inches long. All of that stuff fits well within the paradigm of what we know about Bigfoot and Sasquatch. But this all happened back in 1924, long before the name Bigfoot had graced the covers of newspapers. So what's my takeaway? I think there is some truth to the Ape Canyon incident. I think these miners did encounter some Bigfoots. I think that they probably did shoot at them. And I think that the Bigfoots probably did retaliate and throw rocks at or bang on their cabin walls. So here we are almost a century later, and the Ape Canyon incident is still a famous story throughout the state of Washington and certainly within Bigfoot and Sasquatch literature. We'll probably never know the truth of what actually happened at Ape Canyon in July of 1924, but it's fun to talk about.